My final question, though, is a slightly, it's my final question, but I thought through this whether I should ask this or not, but I felt it's important that we do it because you actually mention it in two footnotes. I found it in two, maybe I missed some. The question of annotations of Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste finds reference in two small footnotes, and much as you admired that book, which you say is a fairly rigorous process, you also say that in one place you say that it's a text that cannot be annotated. Like the text itself cannot lend itself to annotation. It's the nature of that work itself. And in another place, I remember you say that you also not just talk of Arundhati Roy's introduction, but also Perry Anderson's book on Ambedkar, and say that it's a philosophical failure. Could you explain what you meant in these?
Well, I have written. Perry Anderson is another matter, but on Annihilation, its annotation, and Arundhati Roy's introduction, I have written a review, a detailed review in Biblia. So it's all there in Biblia. So my point is that one must read the annotation very carefully and the introduction with full attention, which I tried to do. So in my view, the annotation is a heroic job done. It is something which is done with a kind of passion and at the same time a scholarly intelligence and concentration, which is quite extraordinary. But it is the very nature of the text, which, as we all know, was meant to be a speech, and its mode of address is like that. That what I've in my own review said, there is an inherent abyss, a kind of unbridgeable chasm, a gap between the so-called scholarly support we give to it in terms of all its leads and clues and references, its forensics, which the book has tried to do with extraordinary integrity. I have no doubts about it. But the chasm remains. It's bound to remain. The abyss is bound to stay, because that abyss is very. It's the reality of a speech. So again, it goes back to my point about my thesis about language. It's the very mode of the address, which is its singular, to use a slightly technical linguistic word, a performative force. That cannot be returned, that cannot be translated into, again, to take the other technical counterpoint, into a constative explanation. But the great thing about the annotation is it does it nevertheless. So it is not as if it's not aware of this unbridgeable gap, but it still does it. So it does it on its own term. So between Ambedkar's speech and the annotator's passion, there are two realities that we are actually seeing, not the same reality. So that's the first point. On Arundhati Roy's introduction, I have said this, I've written this in so many words, that it is an introduction which is a kind of it's a derivative introduction, in the sense that it is as if the discourse of Ambedkar, through a kind of negative derivation, produces its great force. But that negative derivation is a derivation from Gandhi. So the force of the demonstration of this negative derivation, as happens with Arundhati Roy's extremely powerful and painstaking treatment, I mean, there is no question about that, it's a very powerful demonstration. I'm not doubting that. But it remains a negative derivation. So the exceptionality of Annihilation of Caste and its own singular historicity, instead of its place in the larger history, which is a kind of theatre of history, a drama of history, which is put so vividly by Arundhati Roy, which is presented with such vivid detail and force and polemical interest by Arundhati Roy, nevertheless is not able to address this heterogeneous history, this immense, incommensurable part the non-reconcilable part of that very history, which is Ambedkar. So Ambedkar's historicity is what I think is missing, and it's a big miss for someone who is capable of what very few people are, that is Arundhati Roy. So that's something I put in somewhat different words in my
it's not the
in my biblio. But I have a few references to that since you asked me in connection with my book, to that review. No, not that review, that introduction. When it actually was put under the scalpel by another well-known writer, Rajmohan Gandhi, in EPW. And I found that to, again I have written about it in other places, I found that to be that apparent taking a part of Arundhati Roy, a completely, a far bigger miss than what Arundhati Roy did. I mean, that was an exercise in what I call in another place a depressing lucidity. It is very lucid, but it's depressing in terms of how it does not in any way acknowledge the fact that Arundhati Roy is not participating in that natural consensus. So it goes back to my initial points about natural consensus. She refuses the natural consensus of what Rajmohan Gandhi calls the pantheon of founding fathers of India, of which Ambedkar is one, but then surely there are others like Gandhi, for instance. Arundhati Roy, I mean, that cannot be missed, that she completely doesn't enter into that. She refuses that consensus. She breaks that consensus with a hammer blow, which is absolutely fantastic. And Rajmohan Gandhi would have her go back to that consensus and objects, why doesn't she do it? Now this is really hitting your head against the wall, and I mean, really not a pleasant sight. Right. So this I bring, apart from, again, use of language in the English language, certain very loose and I should think irresponsible and patriarchal use of the language vis-a-vis personifying someone like Arundhati Roy as someone who intervenes as a gendered person. Is something which I have, in fact, if you read this book towards the end, which I have brought up with a certain amount of vehemence, if I may put it like that. Yes.
Thank you very much. We look forward to reading the next book if and when it is out, and possibly out soon, hopefully.
Well, that will depend on the research program,
right?
Of which I am only taking a very small doing a very little small contribution to a larger research program. So it depends on the story of the research program, what will happen to what I do as part of that. Yes, but yes, I would like to. I'd like to. There are things that I would like to do. Yes.
But maybe even outside of that particular research program, maybe thinking of newer ways of thinking what a research program could be, and that we no matter what happens, we live in that hope that it happens.
I too. I completely share that hope.
Right. And I hope you will see this interview and make sure that you subscribe and look at our channel, and please, we'll also put the link to the extract to this particular book as well, and in that particular extract you will find also the link to find the book itself. So make sure you read this book. It's a book that must be debated, read, and very, very carefully argued for, against, with, etc., etc. Thank you very much, Professor Chaudhary, for your time.
My pleasure entirely.